It's hard to go after such a marvelously generous and learned introduction. But let me just simply say, I'm so glad to be here. We have been planning this for almost 3 years, thanks to COVID. And it's still, for a lot of us, a novelty to go somewhere you haven't been and actually give a live talk to a live audience. So thank you so much for coming tonight. And I would be remiss in not thanking the people who have all made these arrangements possible. The Perry family, Garth and Sherry Lee. And they can't hear me right now, so let's do a sound check. Are we good? Yes, exactly. I was hoping you'd wave if I wasn't good, President Drake and I want to thank, of course, Reverend Bill O'Neill, who has been kindly making sure I arrived here and didn't get lost, and of course Bill Sheehan and Janice Perkins, who made all the arrangements possible. So this now brings me to the subject tonight that I'm going to talk about. These will not be familiar figures, I think, to most, probably to all of you, but I hope by the end of this, you'll find them interesting to think with, much in the way that was just discussed. And so let me first check to see that we're moving in the right direction behind me, since I can't see it otherwise, and we are. So I want to start right now with, and I'm going to put on my reading glasses to do this. I'm going to start right now with a moment in time. In June of 1749, one woman scientist named Laura Bossi sent another, Maria Gaetana Anesi, a letter, which you see up here, thanking her for the gift of a mathematics textbook that Anesi had recently published. And Laura Bossi said to Anesi, in thanking her, you not only enrich the learned world with such a well-calculated, profound, and most useful work, but honor our sex in a special way, demonstrating your singular talent that God gave you and the effort with which you knew how to cultivate it. No matter how many indubitable tests your talent may have already had, this one, however, will always be remembered. And then she added that the honor was not Anesi's alone, but in fact was a credit to all women of science of their age. So, who was Laura Bossi and who was Maria Gaetana Anesi, and why are they even having this conversation? They were two of the most prominent and celebrated women of science in the 18th century, along with their French contemporary, Émilie du Châtelet, author of an important physics textbook that had appeared in 1740 and would be translated into other languages, and ultimately of the only translation into French of Isaac Newton's Principia. Bossi was famously described by Voltaire, Châtelet's close friend, in the following terms that I put up here. There is no Bossi in London, he wrote around 1746, and I would be much happier to be added to your Academy of Bologna than to that of the English, by which he means the Royal Society that was just referred to, even though it has produced a Newton. So why does Bossi merit this kind of praise, this incredible, over-the-top praise by Voltaire? Well, by the end of the talk, you'll know. Maria Gaetana Anesi enjoyed an equal celebrity in her native city. In 1739, a French visitor named Charles de Bois said of Anesi that she was a more stupendous thing than the Duomo of Milan, which was indeed to say a lot. It had just been renovated. He then remarked, erroneously as it turned out, that it was a great pity that she was about to hide all that incredible scientific talent and brain power in a convent by becoming an Augustinian nun. This never happened, and yet the misperception of Anesi as a woman of faith more than science, and of Laura Bossi as a woman of science more than faith, lingered throughout the centuries. In reality, what I hope to demonstrate tonight is that there are complementary examples of what it meant to pursue faith with science and science with faith in the 18th century in Catholic Italy. Both Bossie and Anesi were members of an academy that still exists today. It's Italy's equivalent of the Royal Society, known as the Bologna Academy of Sciences, for the I don't know what we would call it. As a result of my having written a lot about these people, I am a member of this academy, a foreign member, of course. But in the middle of the 18th century, thanks to the Bologna Academy of Sciences and the world that formed around it, the city of Bologna had become a virtual community of women of science in an era in which we absolutely don't expect this to happen. The Deus Ex Machina, the benign but quite determined patron of this whole business, was an enlightened cleric, in fact, a pope by this point in time, Benedict XIV, who did not see science and faith as incompatible. Two truths cannot contradict each other. Galileo famously wrote in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina in 1615. Benedict XIV lived by these words and acted on them. So just to give you a sense of our key questions tonight, why did this Pope so love women of science? What was in it for him? Why did this matter? But then we have to look at the other side of what it meant to these women. What did it mean to be a Catholic woman of science in the 18th century? Because this is not a role we see before this period, and in many respects, it's not a role that we see after. It really does belong to a very particular moment. It sets no particular precedent that crescendos into the modern era of women in science. In fact, it is many of these episodes that become like the tree in the forest that happen, and if you weren't there when it fell, you don't see it anymore. Unless, of course, you go to the archives and dig it up, which is what I like to do, and generally what historians do. The 18th century in Italy was indeed the century after Galileo, right after the famous astronomer and physicist Galileo's trial and condemnation in 1633 by the Roman Inquisition for advocating Copernican astronomy, the idea of a sun-centered universe, right? Galileo had been the rock star scientist of 17th century Italy. And in the blink of an eye in 1633, he became both famous and infamous. And we have lived with that story ever since. We often treat this episode, this famous, infamous episode of the trial of Galileo, as the irrevocable end of modern science, especially in Catholic Italy. But in fact, this episode spurred efforts to effect a new kind of reconciliation between science and religion in that part of the world. What was the rational, inquiring mind but a gift from God? How best to put it to use? These were the kinds of questions that animated conversations throughout the world that produced both Laura Bossi and Maria Gaetana Anesi. In 1732, Laura Bossi became the intellectual rock star of 18th century Italy, celebrated all over Europe in articles written in many languages. Word of it crossed the Atlantic. People certainly heard about her in colonial North America, and celebrated specifically for her science and more generally for her learning. In telling the story of Laura Bossi's life as an experimental physicist for almost half a century, right, in which she worked and researched, taught and experimented, and wrote and published. In telling the story of this scientific life as a completely secular endeavor, we lose sight of the immediate context that made it all possible. Bologna, after all, was the second city of the Papal States, right? Second, in other words, to Rome. It was also an ancient university town, right? It is one of the oldest continuously open universities since the Middle Ages. But last but hardly least, it was a spiritual city. And I want to invite you to think about how that in many ways did shape important aspects of Laura Bossie's life that can't be entirely disentangled from her pursuit of science. On May 12th, 1712, in the city of Bologna, Caterina Vigri, a celebrated member of the Order of the Poor Clares, was finally canonized and became Saint Catherine of Bologna. Vigri was known for her mystical writings and song. She was allegedly the painter of divine mysteries. There are still some paintings today that we attribute to her, though it's highly debated. But more importantly, she was considered a comprehensive model of engaged female in piety and learning. That alone had not led to her canonization, but it was certainly a very important part of her local reputation. Saint Catherine of Bologna put her talent to work in her city. In 1456, she returned to Bologna from travels elsewhere and founded the Franciscan convent of Corpus Domini that still exists today. This was an extremely important convent in a city of many convents. And she became the dynamic center of it in its earliest years. She encouraged women to put their learning to use in the service of faith within its walls, but she also encouraged them to leave the convent and to minister to the sick and poor throughout the city. After her death in 1463, posthumous healing miracles, which of course were central to the canonization all those years later, were attributed immediately and repeatedly to Caterina Vigri. The poor Clares exhumed her body and found her flesh incorruptible. The sweet and holy fluids that emanated from it began to produce miracles. In fact, even touching her body or touching the cloth that had touched her body or being in the presence of it also produced miracles. She had spiritual superpowers like nobody had ever had in the city of Bologna. So as a result, the nuns of Corpus Domini and everyone else who supported them did what good Catholics did. They built a special chapel that still exists today to house her body. You can visit it. You can visit it for spiritual reasons, or you can visit it just because you're curious about these types of practices in a faith that's not your own and in a period that is also not your own. Her body and her breviary are still in this chapel in Corpus Domini. And people began to talk from this point onward about the healing power of a woman who, long before she was canonized, they simply called in Italian La Santa, the saint. People would say, if you said you were going to Corpus Domini, they would say, vado alla Santa, right? I'm going to the saint. That's how well known this was. And let me just quickly, I realized the one problem of having it right behind me is I don't have anything that shows me, because I sometimes have one of those where I am in this, so I'm hoping I don't get off. I will occasionally look, even though it's a little apologies to the people who are live streaming, so I make sure I don't get out of sync here. So what we also see in this period, right, in which she's canonized, is we begin to see all sorts of popular works, including republications and pocket editions of her important writings. So this makes her a very distinctive kind of female mystic and saint in the Catholic tradition. Many have their lives written about them, by their confessors, right, by other male spiritual advisors, but very few, only a handful of women leave behind their own writings, especially for this earlier period. So this made her a fairly distinctive figure. So people could read the advice that she left for posterity in her 7 spiritual weapons as yet another gift of Saint Catherine. So here I want you to step back and imagine and think about the fact that Laura Bossie was born in 1711 as efforts to canonize Saint Catherine reached their peak, and in fact were facilitated from Rome by the cleric who would eventually become Pope Benedict XIV, because he, after all, was a native of Bologna. She surely had a copy of Saint Catherine's 7 spiritual weapons that she read as a young girl. Bossie's oldest son, Giovanni, who became a priest and a professor of moral philosophy and theology, later said of his mother that she was most devoted to our Saint Catherine of Bologna. And this is when we should recall her full name, which was not simply Laura Bossi, but Laura Maria Caterina Bossi. She had indeed been named after the saint. Okay. What about her friend in Milan? What's going on there? Anesi came from a family that was devoted to another saint, San Gaetano, or Saint Gaetan in English, the founder of the Theatine order. This was an austere Christianity that insisted on the importance of restoring simplicity to the Catholic Church, a return to its core values and meaning, right? Stripping away all the excesses of ritual, etc., while remaining Catholic, right? Let's stop there, while remaining Catholic. And what we see in Anesi's case is not only her family's devotion to Saint Gaetan, but her own personal lifelong devotion to the saint. She had a painting of Saint Gaetan in her room her entire long life. We know this from the inventories of the family palace. And again, let us recall her name, because middle names, many, many women in the Italian word are named Maria. The really important name is the one that comes after that. She is Maria Gaetana, right? She too is named after the most important saint for her family, for her particular world in this corner of Milan. Laura Bossi was basically what we would call nowadays middle class. Her father was a lawyer. She was an only child. Her mother seems to have had perpetual health problems, which is how the family physician realized that they had a very bright daughter and started tutoring her in philosophy and Latin and ultimately in science. In Anesi's case, she was the oldest of 22 children by 3 different marriages. Her father, Pietro Anesi, was the son of a wealthy silk merchant who aspired to become an aristocrat. He spent a lot of money. This caused a lot of distress in his family. He held great parties. People liked those. He dressed splendidly. He lived extravagantly. And he loved, as his oldest daughters grew up, he loved putting on evening salons in which his oldest daughter, Maria Gaetana, would basically debate on virtually any subject, but predominantly subjects of science and philosophy. And his second oldest child, Maria Teresa, would play music. She was ultimately a contemporary of Mozart, who had a career not only in Milan, but also in Vienna. I mean, actually a very interesting female musician. Just as Pietro conspicuously spent on his palace and his parties and his clothing and just about everything else, he conspicuously invested in the talents of his children, especially these oldest, who had shown such promise and were so important in turning his home into a place that everyone in Milan might want to go, so that he would rise with that and become important in the city, a somebody rather than a wealthy nobody. And so the result of this is that in 1727, his precocious 9-year-old daughter, Maria Gaetana, was asked to translate into Latin an oration that had been written in her native Italian by her tutor, who was a priest, and then to give it publicly in one of these evening salons that they had. Don Pietro didn't stop there. Everyone was talking about, so of course he had it published, and then he had it republished with all sorts of other treatises by much older women defending women's right to learn. Years later, as an adult, Anesi made its content her own when she wrote the quote that I put at the bottom there: "Nature also has predisposed female minds to every type of science and learning." So here's a very interesting question to think about. Is there something about this environment that makes women's right to learn, in fact, an 18th century Catholic principle? I think the answer is partly yes. Knowledge, as you see in Anesi's writings and in things said about her, knowledge was a divine gift that did not distinguish between male and female. The soul has no sex, as a number of radical theologians began to proclaim in the 17th century in the wake of Descartes' writings about the fact that the mind has no sex. Anesi declared that the God-given ability to cultivate and use the mind had the potential to make better Christians, and she acted on those principles. Back in Bologna, Laura Bossi was definitely using her mind in a very public but somewhat different way. People were also hearing about her talent and starting to visit her family home, much, I think, to the consternation of her parents and herself, none of whom had expected this. But ultimately, things crescendoed. And finally, she was persuaded to not just publicly display her learning, but to actually use it to show that she had been educated at a level that would give her the right to gain a university degree. And so in April of 1732, Laura Bossi, in the public palace, this is like the equivalent of City Hall, right, in City Hall, with the entire town watching, defended all these theses, right, statements of knowledge that she debated with professors from the university, all of this in Latin. And it went well. It went well. And so 1 month later, in May, she receives her degree. And I'll just stop for a second and invite you to notice how many of the people in the room, you have to look, they're a little bit little, but they're bigger for you because they're up on the screen. How many of these people are clerics, including, of course, the Archbishop of Bologna, who is the Deus Ex Machina of this whole business. All of this was at the behest of Prospero Lambortini, who had become Archbishop of Bologna in 1731, and in 1740 would become Pope while retaining his archbishopric for many years because Bologna mattered so much to him as his hometown. Lambortini didn't just make sure that she got her degree, and she publicly defended these theses so that everyone could see, everyone could give public testimonial to her learning. He also had a silver medal cast and a crown of laurels made for her and an ermine graduate's cape. So she would always, always have the special marks that she indeed was the first woman that anyone could document to graduate from this ancient university. But Lambortini didn't stop there. And as you can see here, he pushed the city to give Laura Bossi the hardest thing of all, a paid professorship. By the fall of 1732, she had been appointed to a professorship with a salary. This caused no end of controversy. There were a lot of unpaid professors teaching, waiting their turn, all of them male, of course. But things were smoothed over, and by December of 1732, she gave her first lecture, again in public in this very ceremonial way in front of an audience, not just of students and faculty as we're doing here today, but of a much broader public. Well, we're doing that too also because we're live streaming, right? So we're doing all these things. So what did Laura Bossi talk about? She talked about knowledge. She talked about the principles of philosophy and science as we understood this in fairly general ways, but she also talked at some points in this inaugural historic lecture about what it meant to be a woman speaking before men. She was well aware of passages such as Paul, 1 Corinthians, women should remain silent in the churches, or Reverend O'Neill and I were talking about this, attributed to Paul and debated still today, first epistle to Timothy, right? A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet, right? 1 Timothy 2. But I think Bossi, of course, and many of the clerics there, surely all of them in fact, also knew the passage from Galatians. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Thus, during the 1730s, with the full support of church leadership, Laura Bossi became a woman to teach physics and philosophy to men in this university. And she would do that for the rest of her life. Now, there are a lot of ups and downs about what that job was really about that I'm happy to talk about in discussion if you're interested in. But in the interests of timeliness, I want to kind of stay focused on the main theme tonight, right, which is not about the ins and outs of her career, but about this relationship between knowledge and faith, and looking at these two lives of women of science in Catholic Italy together, to see both what they share as well as their divergent paths. So what was Anesi doing in the 1730s? She was studying with her Theatine tutors, one of whom was her spiritual advisor and confessor, but she was also studying a lot of philosophy and languages. She was cultivating a growing passion for mathematics. She was digging in deeper, right, into the work of people like Descartes and Leibniz, and of course, Newton. And in the very year that Laura Bossi became Bologna's rock star, she was dealing with the death of her mother, right, the first of the three wives of Pietro Anesi, which put her into a deep depression and took all of the, she stopped studying, of course. I mean, she was just absolutely devastated by the death of her mother, and it took quite a while for her to come back from this. And this is surely a moment in ways that the paper record cannot tell us, in which her spirituality deepened in profound and, I think, important ways, right, that were transformative for her life. So the 1730s were for her a very difficult time, and then she emerged from it and continued to do what her father wanted her to do, which is to debate matters of philosophy and science and any subject related to it in the evening salons while her sister showed off her musical talent. But of course, the people in Milan were well aware of what had been going on in Bologna. There was a woman with a degree, a professorship, a job, teaching physics. You know, what were the people in Milan to do? How could they improve on this idea? In 1738, a book appeared by Anesi called simply The Philosophical Propositions. It contains 191 propositions. That's way more than the number of theses that Bossie defended in 1732. This was a virtual super degree, like practically 2 PhDs in one, made very public by being published. And the content of it is interesting for thinking about, again, what is the model, right? What does it mean to be deepening your knowledge of science in this world? Because not all, but significant parts of this book are very informative in understanding the relationship between knowledge and faith. So I've given you a few excerpts here to just give you kind of an idea of what this content looks like. Our mind is furnished with a double faculty of intellect and will. Anesi invites the readers to think about what it means to calibrate, to balance, to find that equilibrium between passion and reason, and to use both productively together, how that each of them, when too separated, may not be productive. Nature everywhere proclaims that God exists. She is very much a natural theologian in the making, right? Skillfully weaving in her religious readings with her knowledge of all of the philosophical and scientific systems of the day. This includes, of course, strong praise of contemporary scientists, cutting-edge knowledge, of whom the highest praise goes to, as she calls him, the illustrious Newton. And she talks quite a bit about what she's taken away from Newton's philosophy. And I've just given you one example here, which is she takes Newton's idea of gravity, right, the law of universal attraction, and she engages with what has been the perennial debate. Newton never spells out on paper what exactly causes this, right? What is the ultimate cause of gravity, of this invisible force knitting the world together? Anesi, like a number of people, responds to this by both being very persuaded by it philosophically and scientifically, but ultimately wanting to fill in the picture. Gravity certainly must not be forced to return to any other cause than continual and perennial divine action. In other words, it is for her the sublime example of what it means to find divine action in the world. So how then does she treat that controversial issue from the previous century? that launched the whole world of Catholic science in this period, which is to say what had led to the trial and condemnation of Galileo, the Copernican hypothesis, as she calls it, when talking about different systems of the world. And she argues for all of its merits, right? All of the things that have proven to be very useful and potentially persuasive, but ultimately she says, no one to the present has demonstrated that this order of things is necessary. That is the Catholic position, it's evolving. By the way, she also talks and several times about Galileo and praises him as highly as Newton, right? So we're seeing that world of the rehabilitation of Galileo in the very pages of her philosophical propositions. 1744 is when the first officially authorized reprinting of Galileo's works, including his scandalous dialogue for which he was condemned, occurs under Benedict XIV. 1758, the last year of his papacy, is when the Index of Prohibited Books drops the prohibition against not old books like Galileo's, they leave them on the index, but any new books published discussing heliocentrism are now allowed to be published without any further controversy. Anesi ultimately felt that scripture should not be used to defend one scientific or philosophical system over another. So she was very carefully calibrating where theology ought to intervene in some of these questions, where was it appropriate and where did she think it was not a question for theology to answer, but one that needed to play itself out, perhaps more in these other realms. Okay, so this is an absolutely tour de force publication that she does in 1738. And we would think, right after that, now she's going to win a MacArthur Fellowship, get a great job, get a raise. No, in 1739, she goes to her father and tells him that she doesn't want to entertain people anymore, and she'd like to stop doing all these public displays of her learning. Her biographer describes it as a moment where he's hit by a thunderbolt because he's so shocked that she wants to give up all the fun that he's constructed around the celebrity that he has created for her. This is when Agnesi's quest for spiritual and intellectual clarity began in earnest, and she began to be more not what he wanted, but what she wanted out of all of this. Now, this is going a little bit backward. It really is bad having it right behind me, I have to say. Excuse me about that. I can see now I've lost. No, I went back this way. There we go. Let's move forward. All right. The year Agnesi's book appeared, Bossie also made a momentous decision to get married. In April of 1738, she wed in the church of San Petronio in Bologna. She wed Giuseppe Verratti, a physician, an experimenter, a fellow scientist, and also a professor at the university. And she actually wrote a remarkable letter in which she described to her friend why she married Verratti. Therefore, I have chosen someone who walks the same path of learning and who, from long experience, would not dissuade me from it. That is a remarkable letter. I can assure you that there are not normally letters like this written all these centuries ago. Shortly after their wedding, that would ultimately produce 8 children, 5 of whom survived infancy, her brother-in-law, Ferdinando Verratti, who was a priest, but also canon of the Church of San Petronio, said of her, she has always paired morals and saintly Christian virtues with sciences. So I want to underscore that as part of Bossie's reputation in her own town, that in many ways, she too was cultivating a reputation as a good Catholic, while also pursuing this career that, among other things, led to her choice of marriage partner, because so many others would not have allowed her to continue to do what she did once she became a wife and mother. The Bossi-Verratti household created within the next decade, not only a brood of children, but also an experimental physics, a home laboratory that was better than any of the laboratories at the university or the Bologna Academy of Sciences in the state-of-the-art equipment that they had, and was as good as any laboratory in most of the universities in Europe. And it was in this home laboratory that she developed one of the legendary courses in experimental physics that she taught in her home not in these ceremonial lectures in front of people in public lecture halls talking about anything and everything related to being a learned woman, but specifically about the value and importance of this new development in post-Newtonian development in physics. For the next decade, she had a bevy of important disciples, all of them male, who became some of the most important scientists in late 18th and early 19th century Italy. Now, Anesi had given up on the salon and the fancy dress, but she continued her pursuit, not of philosophy or science in general, but specifically of mathematics throughout the 1740s. In this period that Laura Bossi begins to develop her course in experimental physics is when Anesi writes the book that Laura Bossi thanks her for. Her discovery of the clarity, rigor, and simplicity of algebra and calculus imbued her mathematics with spiritual meaning for herself, and as she puts on the cover of this book, for Italian youth. By this point in time, Anesi was teaching, but not in a university. She had joined the Congregation of Christian Doctrine and was teaching in the local churches on Sunday afternoons and holidays, caring for poor and sick women in the largest hospital in the city, running an unofficial infirmary in the family palace, much to her father's dismay. In short, she was discovering her spiritual vocation. Her public career was basically over, but she was still doing science. This new book is what led to her admission to the Bologna Academy, and also led to the offer from Bologna of an honorary professorship at the University of Bologna in mathematics. All of this, of course, again, orchestrated by the Pope for a woman he called, in the letter he wrote her, his delightful daughter. Benedict said that he knew just enough analytic geometry and calculus to understand the importance of what she's done. And it is all to the glory of Italy, he said. Anesi never went to from Milan to Bologna to take up that professorship. She stayed on the books for almost 50 years as an imaginary professor of mathematics in Bologna, because it mattered there, but it certainly didn't matter to her. Not in the way that was something that she wanted to activate. It was Pietro Anesi's death in 1752 that finally allowed Anesi to fully liberate herself from any lingering sense of obligation to the family plan. And it was in this period, from the 1750s onwards, that Anesi fully invested in her role in the urban mission of faith in the city of Milan, in charity, education, and social work, in what it meant to be a Catholic woman, not in retreat, not in a convent, right, as the French visitor had mistakenly thought she was going to do in 1739, but actually in the world. This was her answer for ultimately what it meant to be useful, right? To use her knowledge and her learning, but also to use her faith. What does it mean to be useful? Laura Bossi had a very different, but I think an equally Catholic answer. In 1755, some years into the success of her School of Physics, for which she got many raises, by the way. And by the way, she wrote the raise letters for her husband and her sons in her own hand. She managed everybody's careers. It's an amazing fact. The handwriting gives it away. I'm not making that up. It's just true that she did. And yet experimental physics has become in our time such a useful and necessary science, right? That utility is not just pragmatic, right, or secular. That utility is also her own sense of what it means to be a Catholic woman of science and faith in the world. To enlighten with science, with a science that was tangible, practical, and required a laboratory as well as a classroom. This was what Laura Bossi was all about. By 1766, she had acquired another professorship of experimental physics at an institution called the Collegio Montalto, that was basically a scholarship residential academy for poor students, poor boys from central Italy. In 1776, just 2 years before her death, she acquired a third professorship when she was appointed, finally, to a job she had always sought and always been the most qualified candidate for decades. She became the Institute Professor of Experimental Physics in 1776. During those decades, Anesi had renounced most of her inheritance and done what she wanted, living simply and quietly, but she was certainly not invisible. When the Archbishop of Milan asked her to direct the female ward of a brand new charitable institution known as the Pio Albergo Trivulzio, which, by the way, there's a scandal going on about what happened in this during COVID because of, you know, the way in which many of, it's still basically an old folks home, right? It's still an assisted living home today. And so there's, if you Google it, you'll see there's all sorts of stuff that's going on about the discussion of what happened during the worst part of the outbreak in Lombardy of COVID. In any case, but in this period, it was absolutely brand new, right? It opens in 1771. It expands from 100 to about 400 patients by the end of the century. And so she was invited now to play this official administrative role very late in her life, caring for the old, the disabled, the sick, and the poor of the city. She proved to be a tough-minded and forceful administrator, arguing for what her patients needed and defending her right to make these decisions. Ultimately, she moved into the Pio Albergo Trivulzio in 1783 and died there. Mathematicians continued to seek her out, but she rarely responded as the centuries went on. And yet nobody forgot that she was, at the end, Milan's greatest scientist of this period. Or great, I should say, let me qualify that, greatest woman scientist, because there are other interesting scientists, many of whom are highly appreciative of her long beyond her life. Laura Bossi taught, experimented, corresponded with other scientists, presented her research in annual lectures at the Bologna Academy, even though only a few of them were published, led, in other words, a very active life as a scientist. Yet she also performed acts of charity that were discussed more after her death than during her life. And you can see this here, for instance, in her primary biography published in the year of her death, in which Giovanni Fantuzzi says, most zealous of her religion, she was vigilant and passionate about carrying out her obligations, full of charity towards her neighbor. Indeed, she gave very clear signs with what she did of how much more she would have done if she had had even greater fortune. And that's a really key point. She wasn't wealthy like Anesi. She didn't have an inheritance to give up. She had a family to support. She needed the paycheck, but she nonetheless did what she could in a far more ordinary life, extraordinary by other standards, but ordinary in economic terms. But let's also look at the story of family piety, because that, of course, also tells us a lot about who somebody is. Her oldest, Giovanni, said his first mass in 1761. When he got his theology degree in 1764, they held the degree ceremony unusually in the Anatomy Theater rather than in the Church of San Petronio, so his mother could attend and participate, right? Because of Paul, they couldn't do it in the church. One of her younger sons, Giacomo, in the 1770s became an oratorian, right? He joined the order of Filippo Neri, right? So two of her sons go into religious orders. Last but hardly least, and most tragically, and this returns us to the end of the story, I'm just going to wrap up with a couple things now. Her daughter, Caterina Maria Teresa, was actually one of three daughters that Laura Bossi and Verratti had. The other two died in infancy. She was the only one to live to adulthood. And at the age of 22, sadly, she died just as she was about to take her vows to become a nun in Corpus Domini. This tragic moment, and generally the tragedy of the daughters in Laura Bossi's world, because 4 of her 5 sons outlived her, right, lived fully into adulthood, certainly brings to mind the increasingly well-known story of Galileo's oldest daughter. Both of his daughters were in a Tuscan convent, but it was his oldest daughter that he corresponded with for 10 crucial years of his life. which included the trial and condemnation. It was Virginia Galileo, Sor Maria Celeste, who offered to take up the burden of her father's penitence to say his prayers when she finally understood what had happened in Rome from this small, poor convent just outside the city of Florence. She would die only a few months after Galileo returned from Rome to his perpetual house arrest for the rest of his life. That was his tragedy. We don't know if Laura Bossi wrote this poem for her daughter because she actually was socially obliged to write a lot of poetry for lots of events, which included lots of daughters entering convents. But of course, I found this in the archive, and I like to think that it might be related to her daughter being about to enter Corpus Domini, because the poem is simply entitled Wearing the Religious Habit. And I've given you a couple of snippets, right? Tell me, fine girl, what thought leaves your mind? You know, the ritual of entering the convent was a very public one in the city. You actually walked through the city. People stood outside the doors. You know, you said because then you were going into full enclosure in a convent like this. And then this wonderful reminder, you have outside the cloister a friendly star that guides the fearful pilot to its place. I do think if she's not talking to her daughter, she certainly understands as a mother what that moment is for somebody else's daughter. Laura Bossi, as her sons reminded us when they wrote about their mother, asked from the moment of her daughter's death to be buried in Corpus Domini next to Caterina. And that is indeed what happened in 1778. The full tomb no longer exists, but you can still see this very faded tomb that prominently has incised in it Benedict XIV. That actually is one of the largest set of letters in the middle of this tomb, faded as it is. You might even be able to see it on the screen right now. Laura Bossi's funeral was an affair of state. And I can see it didn't go forward, so I'm going to try that again. There we go. Yet it was also a moment to reflect on the meaning of her life and work and to think about how it all came together. And in the orations given by the students of the Collegio Mondalto, where her son Giovanni was by then a professor and would ultimately become rector of that institution, her students, including her son, all of her sons studied with her, remembered Laura Bossi and had the following to say that I think is actually quite profound. Indeed, she had a great piety precisely because she was great in philosophy, confirming indeed what the celebrated Bacon, this is so interesting, he didn't pick a Catholic, Francis Bacon, right, the 17th century politician, philosopher, and essayist, Bacon of Verulam wrote, "A little philosophy easily leads to incredulity. A great deal brings one back to religion." This is how they wish to remember Laura Bossi in the weeks just following her death. One of the young students who might have been present for this oration was a young man on scholarship named Francesco Silverio Castillone. He was studying at the Collegio Mondalto, and his most important teacher and spiritual advisor counseled him to enter the priesthood rather than becoming a lawyer. That is ultimately what he did. He was a young student in 1778 who became Pope Pius VIII at the end of his life. He was only Pope for a year. He becomes Pope in 1829. And he warmly praised Giovanni Verratti as a great Christian educator. During her lifetime, Laura Bossi's learning had been declared repeatedly a miracle. But I think that she would have responded that all she had done was by the grace of Saint Catherine of Bologna. And I will now give you the Coda Ananyasi, right, and how we pull these all together. Anesi outlived Laura Bossi by over 20 years. She dies in 1799, working in Milan's brand new hospital. Some called her a Christian heroine and praised her for giving up science. Others, proponents of a more secular, political, and radicalized enlightenment, felt that she was shamefully neglected They presented her as being forced to work with the poor because no one in Bologna would give her a professorship in her native city. This, of course, is how they understood her, not how she understood herself. In 1781, they secretly commissioned a marble bust. They actually sent an artist stealth, incognito, into the hospital to draw her because she had refused these kind of portrait making in an effort to revive her fame. She, in contrast to the fanfare around Laura Bossi's death and burial in Corpus Domini, was buried in an unmarked grave outside of the Porta Romana of Milan at her request. Her body performed no miracles. Her rooms never became a shrine. By contrast, the scientist who came closest to being sanctified in 18th century Italy was, ironically, Galileo. In 1737, his body was dug up from a rather ignominious grave that he had been given because he had been accused of heresy, tried, condemned, asked to recount. It was dug up. It was reburied with great pomp and ceremony. And in the process, as some of you may know, some of his fingers, a vertebra, and a few other body parts were cut off and placed in what are unmistakably reliquary cases. But that, of course, is an entirely other, if complementary story to the one I've told tonight about two of the most interesting women of science in 18th century Italy, or perhaps in any period. And I hope this gives you some sense of why I think this Catholic world after Galileo is far more complicated than it often is presented in the textbook accounts of the relationship between science and religion. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions or comments. I know there are people with microphones around, so yeah, I think we've got the first one there, and then we'll just so go ahead, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier in the speech that one of the women, Fazi, I think that's how you pronounce her name. Okay, anyways, you said that she wrote several poems. So do you happen to have a favorite one by her, or?
You know, I probably need to become more of a connoisseur of her poems, because they're actually, the number of poems written about her is without end, particularly in 1732. It's like making the metal. It's part of the, it's like the Instagramming, right? People are instant messaging and, tweeting. They're just, but only they do it in poetry because it's the 18th century. So I don't, but I'm going to think about that because that's a very interesting idea. But I will tell you something funny that I noticed years ago when I first started working with her archive, which is at one point she actually complains about how often she's being asked to write poetry because maybe she doesn't especially like it. Maybe more seriously, she thinks it's kind of a misuse of her talent, and it's a kind of like how Anesi is reacting to the salon, that this is also the salonification of her talent. And she loves physics. I mean, she absolutely, she makes a point after her degree of studying more math so she can really do them. She's primarily an experimental and philosophical physicist. Those are, she's not a mathematician the way Anesi is, or some other contemporaries like Châtelet, but like she wants to invest in that. And so I think she's a little ambivalent, and yet she's not, I mean, I will say that she's not bad at it. And maybe I chose this partly because I think there's something there that might actually be personal. Like she might have written that poem for reasons that aren't just because people expect her to write, to be part of the culture of the city, because she's a civic ornament. Yeah.
Okay, so quick follow-up question. Did she ever like write any poetry about what she was doing with physics?
Ah, that's a great question. Mostly no, actually, because these really are very, but others do. In fact, there is an absolutely wonderful poem written by a Venetian who saw her degree ceremony. And he writes a poem in which he talks about the sevenfold light of Newton, it's his equivalent to rewrite Alexander Pope's famous poem on Newton's optics. So he basically writes a poem about her as the Minerva of Bologna. And he then takes this poem, and it's published and circulated with a lot of the poetry from 1732. But he then deposits his own poem into what becomes a best-selling book called Newtonianism for Ladies. That's an international bestseller that appears later, about 5 years later. And so there are that to me, this poem by Francesco Algarotti on, the sevenfold light of Newton is really beautiful. And it is also inspired directly by seeing her debate these things in, of course, a very scholastic and scientific way in Latin, but then he writes a beautiful poem in Italian about it. So yeah, thank you for that. And I know we had some other hands that were up earlier, so maybe if any of you want to have, yes. What?
Yeah, I just have a real quick question, because being kind of agnostic on all of this, I didn't know about these women or any of these things. Are they truly exceptional individuals that we're learning about? Or if we were to peek behind the veneer, would we find numerous women and other folks contributing that just don't make, how history is written, haven't gotten the attention that they deserve?
Well, there's kind of two ways to answer that. Are they exceptional in the sense that did something similar like this happen to a lot of other women? No, I've been researching these kinds of cases for way too long, actually. And I've written on a lot of others that I didn't talk about tonight, but there is this, it's the reason that this is not a precedent. It is a culture of exceptionality, right? Of making exceptions and praising them for their exceptionality. And so exceptions, as we always know, can go very far. They can break rules that otherwise apply to the rest of us, right? It's the exception after all. But so one way to answer is to say yes. But another way to answer that is also to say, well, but under what circumstances are people even allowed to become literate, right? Most people are still not literate, right? Literacy is much higher than it was a century or two earlier, let alone in the medieval world, but that doesn't mean that everybody's literate. So who's literate? Who has access to this kind of learning? Because this is not just basic literacy, like the Sunday school that Maria Anesi teaches is giving you basic literacy. Reading, not writing, no math. She's not teaching math, actually, which is amazing. She does this textbook, but so she's teaching it when she publishes, but not in a classroom. And so, yeah, who has access to this kind, so it's that, so this is what you start to see in these discussions about women's education, right? Where people are talking about that, that why in the end, right, are people not given access to these things? And one of the things that's so interesting about the kinds of Catholic action movements, to use a more modern phrase, that you see in the second half of the 18th century is there's a lot of much more interest by clerics, by nuns, right, by men and women in these newer religious orders who see education as part of caring for the poor. And that is the first step in expanding it, but it's not going to produce, like you see the Samaskins, for instance, are actually doing some mathematics teaching to boys mostly. There's the Ursulines, there are other orders who are teaching the girls. And so it's not fully integrated, but you're seeing the beginning of the steps. So what I like to do as a historian is see, okay, where are the building blocks, right? Where are the different building blocks that might eventually make this possible for more rather than just for a few? And so that's, we're kind of seeing that process, but I have been very struck by the non-repeatability of these experiments, because some of the stories I've worked on are these absolutely both poignant and sometimes hysterically funny, funny not for the people who went through this, of people who, they hear about Laura Bossi, they want to be the next one, or they hear about Anesi, they want to write the next textbook, but they never, there are too many obstacles to actually repeating the experiment. It's not easily built on, not yet. Yeah, so I hope that's a partial answer, because I think that's a really important question. Thank you for that. I think just for the people who are not live, it's really helpful.
Thank you. So I'm curious, as a woman of science, I'm curious about Saint Catherine. I don't know if you could tell me more about her, but I'm curious about the potential science behind her mysticism. Was she potentially an herbalist or considered a healer? Was she actually experimenting and using science in her healing?
Oh, I love that question. Is she using science in her healing? Not directly, right? Because people, of course, she in her own time, but indirectly, yes. Corpus Domini is one of a number of convents, but in Bologna, it's probably the most famous for its pharmacy. So that's an interesting distinction. So one of my friends who teaches at Emory, Sharon Strokia, wrote a whole book. It's called, Forgotten Healers. And it's about the women, the nun pharmacists of Renaissance Italy. And so think about that. If you ever go to, I'll just pick Florence because the train station is near Santa Maria Novella, which is a famous convent. And people still go and they buy soaps and things. That's a kind of remnant of this convent, the convent labor that both economically supported these convents, but also in many instances were connected to the spiritual mission, especially the pharmacies were often very connected. So for instance, Galileo's oldest daughter basically runs, they don't make money off of their pharmacy, but she tends to the health of the nuns because she's one of the most literate and competent. And so, yeah, so there are these kind of indirect ways. So it's not the focal point, it's when you read the 7 spiritual weapons, there's no science in it of that kind. There's a lot of theological science in it, there's another kind of science. But I think it's interesting how you get this kind of middle ground, like a place like a convent pharmacy is another interesting trading zone between science and faith. That these are those medicines are made with knowledge and with faith, right? They have both put together and people see them as such and people know, in the 18th century, I think Laura Bossi has a number of health problems. And I think, it wouldn't surprise me that they take her to the chapel. It wouldn't surprise me if they bought or if she bought for some of her kids, some of these medicines. People would sell the sort of water that had the oil from the effluvia of Catherine. There were all these kind of contact things that turned into medicine. So it's actually a really interesting part of convent life. There's so many things go on in convents. People write plays, they write rebellious political theory. Convents are really interesting spaces in the medieval and early modern world. I think they're really interesting today. I just don't know as much about them today. But yeah, so yeah. Hildegard of Bingen is the ultimate model of, there's Hildegard from medieval Germany. There's an abbess who writes philosophy, cosmology, and medical treaties. So yes, that's the ultimate model of somebody who does both.
With these teachers, are there some significant, what we might call significant students of theirs that would have recognizable names that trace themselves back to either of these two ladies?
So Anesi it's interesting. She is a product of such an interesting collection of teachers, many of them in religious orders, but many of them also scientists, theologians, right? They're very good mathematicians, physicists, philosophers. They're publishing in these areas. One of the most important of her mentors in the period that she works on her mathematics textbook, The Analytical Institutions, is, first he comes to Milan for certain jobs, but ultimately he's appointed, I think, professor of mathematics, or maybe philosophy, but I think it's mathematics in Pavia, Pavia is this cutting edge university in the middle of the 18th century. They're reinventing, putting in lots of modern disciplines, really, they can pick and choose who they're hiring. She works in the period that she's doing the science, she works very collaboratively, and not just with older mentors, but also with younger people who then, as they do their own work, return to, once you start looking, you find, people used to say, if you read an old history of mathematics literature, people will say, well, the book is just derivative. That's nice that she found a vernacular language for the calculus for people who read Italian, not Latin. No, that's not nice. That's actually really important. There's a reason that John Colson, who was the Lucasian professor of mathematics in the mid to late 18th century, I think, he dies in 1760. He translates the entire book but he doesn't publish it in his lifetime, but it still gets published at the end of the century in English. So you can look at an English translation of Anesi. It gets translated by the Paris Academy, which has an incredible group of mathematicians, into French. So yeah, you end up, once you start looking, you see many more references to her work in books by, really some of the leading mathematical physicists, especially from Lombardy, like Lagrange, who was not a direct disciple, but he talks about how he learned from this book, how important this book was as the beginnings of his introduction to the work that he did. And so that is a somebody, right? That's not a nobody, And a similar example in the case of Laura Basi, of all these, I've been spending a lot more time looking at her disciples. And some of them I already knew, but some were a little more obscure to me. But it turns out to be a really interesting group. But I'll give you the one that is the most fascinating. She has a younger second cousin named Lazzaro Spallanzani. And if you look up, Spallanzani is not a household name nowadays, but if you look him up, you'll find out he is very important for the development of the idea of regeneration. He's busy cutting off the tails and buddy pot heads of salamanders, and so on and so forth. He's a naturalist. He teaches at Pavia. He gets one of these jobs at Pavia. He founds their natural history collection, experimental laboratory. And so he is a student in Bologna. He'd gone there to study law. And he always talked about the fact that it was his older cousin who persuaded him through her example to give up law and become a scientist. And he dedicates one of his earliest publications to her, calling her Mia venerata maestra. My venerated, well, we would say mistress sounds so weird in English, right? So, but in the end, that he wants to acknowledge her tutelage, that she was that important to his early formation. So important that when he was doing his regeneration experiments, she was one of the key people that he would send boxes of little salamanders to from Pavia to Bologna to have her replicate the experiments, even though she wasn't a naturalist. I mean, she's mostly doing electrical experiments and mechanical, kind of Newtonian, Galilean physics. And Franklin, she and her husband are both they're both followers of Benjamin Franklin. They're Franklinists in their electrical theories. But yeah, he trusts her judgment, as do many people. You see that in her correspondence with a lot of contemporaries, that they seek out her opinion. So yeah, once you start looking, it's actually a very interesting trajectory. And people did say, you see this in, people did say for a period, you have to dig into the archives to find it, but I found this fabulous document where her youngest son, who actually inherits the physics cabinet and his father's job because he gets a medical degree. So he kind of combines both his parents' jobs. And he has to prove that he is a citizen of Bologna, because he lost his driver's license, which is to say his father was not originally from Bologna, and they have a law, you have to be from Bologna to teach at the university. So he had to prove that he was really from Bologna. So they go and interview all these guys who are basically his age plus or minus, and everyone says, yeah, sono andato alla scuola di Laura Basi. I went to Laura Basi's school. Like people would go around Bologna. It was kind of like being part of a club that you, sort of like when you talked about your professor. I went to that school. I was in that classroom. I remember Paolo. He was playing on the floor, or I was studying with him. We were the same age. They would all talk about it in that way. So yeah, in a period, it was very well known, and then it disappeared. And that's the way history is. And then it's there for us to rediscover, because in the end, it's always been there.
One more question, and then we'll have time for some interaction with the professor. Garth, you get the last question.
Of course, now we refer to the second half, the other half of humanity, the women, and we have a growing awareness of what they are capable of. But in the 18th century, you have this Pope Benedict XIV, who becomes a patron of outstanding women. My question is, did he feel like he was the patron of a very few, but very gifted, exceptional women with the assumption there probably aren't many, or was there any part of him who sensed that given educational opportunities such as these exceptional women had gotten, that there might be the other half?
I think that he is thinking about this at times. I just don't think he really can quite imagine what that means other than to continue this, what has been even before him, this kind of growing investment in, say, the Congregation of Christian Doctrine, right? Having the church be much more proactive in picking up poor kids off the streets and giving them the rudiments of a Christian education, which includes also literacy, right? And includes not everything, as I was just talking about a bit ago, but includes more than nothing, and a lot more than that, in fact. So I think he's looking for that. So why do I think he did this? Why is he investing in these? So one is, I've come to think he's a very interesting pope, and he's not perfect, he's flawed, he's on the side of some things we might deeply disagree about some of the political decisions he makes, but in this area, I think he actually I think he believes in this idea that the soul has no sex and therefore talent can come in many different forms. I think he is fed up with the indolent aristocracy of many parts of Italy, and he believes that the solutions to his society come from a broad and hopefully expanding middle, right? Expanding downward, can take the upward too, but he likes people of talent who want to use their abilities. And he also deeply believes, I think this is part of this project of what it means to be an enlightened Catholic for him. This is the guy who still today wrote what is the foundation of the modern proceedings for canonization, his treatise that he wrote when he was the devil's advocate, before he was archbishop, before he was pope. His treatise on the reform of canonization proceedings brought together the rule of law and modern anatomy and other aspects of the scientific and legal principles of evidence with theology. He was an incredibly learned and smart man. Not a perfect man, but a learned and smart man. And this was also, and on the human side, people found him so human and so funny that they actually collected up some of his wittier sayings into books that they called lambortiniana. There is no other pope we can say that about. No other pope was ever that funny or human. He refused to ride in carriages. So he, I think, believed in these kind of principles of simplicity that are embodied in various ways, especially by Anesi, right, in the way she leads her life. He gets out of his carriage. He shocks people in Rome because the popes don't do that. They don't get out of their carriage. They're supposed to ride, right, in a gilded way through a gilded city. So I think this is part of that shaking things up a bit, right? But how far do you even understand what it means to rattle the cage? How far can you? So I think it's also when you look at his role in the canonization of some of these women saints and who he's choosing and who his mentors have chosen also, this is an era of a real kind of prominence of female piety in a way that you haven't seen since the late Middle Ages, or certain moments like the world of Teresa of Avila. So that's also, I think, part of it as well, is how the two, right, his promotion of pious and learned women really are part of this broader project of what it means to be a modern Catholic in an 18th century sense. So that's kind of the brief version that I'm happy to think more about with you or anyone, or talk about other things, or you can object to if you don't agree with it. All objections are taken seriously in the interest, of course, of trying to do our best to do justice to the subjects that we study.
Please join me in thanking Professor Booth.